The wind howled through the canyon pass like a wounded animal, carrying with it the first bitter taste of winter. Snow fell in lazy spirals across the Montana Territory borderlands, dusting the jagged rocks and sparse pines that clung to the mountainsides. This was unforgiving country, where the earth seemed to resent human presence and only the stubborn or the desperate dared to call it home. Caleb Harrow stood at the edge of his property, watching his horses huddle together against the cold. At 32, he had the weathered look of a man who'd spent more nights under stars than roofs. His hands, scarred from rope burns and hard labor, rested on the fence post he'd driven into the frozen ground 3 winters ago. The small ranch wasn't much to look at. A log cabin, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, and a corral that held 8 horses. But it was his, earned through sweat and solitude. He preferred it that way. The nearest neighbor was a half-day's ride, and Cedar Falls, the closest excuse for a town, lay 20 miles south through treacherous passes. Out here, a man could live on his own terms, answering to no one but the seasons and his livestock. The letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, carried by a supply wagon that made the journey to his ranch every few months. Caleb had recognized his sister Rose's neat handwriting immediately, but the contents had made him read it 3 times before the words sank in. Dearest Caleb, it had begun. I hope this letter finds you well and not too cross with me for what I've done. You know I worry about you up there alone, especially with winter coming. A woman shouldn't meddle in her brother's affairs, but sometimes love requires a gentle push. The gentle push Rose referred to was her decision to place an advertisement in an eastern newspaper on his behalf, seeking a mail-order bride. She'd even included a copy of the advertisement, which painted him as a prosperous rancher seeking a hardy woman of good character for companionship and marriage in the beautiful Montana frontier. Prosperous. Caleb had almost laughed at that. If owning 8 horses and a leaking roof counted as prosperity, then perhaps Rose hadn't completely lied. But the damage was done. According to her letter, she'd already received several responses and had selected a suitable candidate, a woman named Eleanor Vaughn from Philadelphia who would arrive on the winter supply run. That was today. Caleb pulled his coat tighter and headed back to the cabin, his boots crunching through the thin layer of snow. Inside, he'd made an attempt at tidiness, pushing his few belongings into corners and scrubbing the worst of the grime from the plank floors. The place still looked like what it was, a bachelor's refuge, sparse and functional, with little thought given to comfort or beauty. The sound of wheels and horses drew him back outside, through the falling snow. He could make out the supply wagon lurching up the rough trail, Jack Morrison at the reins as always. But this time, there was a figure beside him on the bench, wrapped in a dark traveling cloak. Caleb's jaw tightened. Part of him had hoped the woman would change her mind, that the reality of frontier life would send her back east before she ever reached his door. He wasn't ready for this, for another person in his space, for the complications that came with expectation and obligation. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the cabin. Jack, a grizzled man who'd been making this run for 15 years, gave Caleb a knowing grin. Got your delivery. Harrow, this one's a bit more delicate than your usual supplies. The woman climbed down with Jack's assistance, her movements careful but not fragile. When she pushed back her hood, Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Eleanor Vaughn was perhaps 25, with chestnut hair pulled back in a simple style and eyes the color of storm clouds. Beautiful. Yes, but it was something else that caught his attention, the way she held herself, calm and contained, like someone carrying a weight they'd grown accustomed to bearing. "Mr. Harrow," she said, her voice steady despite the cold. "I'm Eleanor Vaughn. I believe your sister told you to expect me. She told me what she'd done." Caleb replied, the words coming out harsher than intended. Didn't give me much say in the matter. If his rudeness bothered her, Eleanor didn't show it. She merely studied him with those gray eyes, taking in his rough appearance and the cabin behind him. "I understand this situation is irregular. If you'd prefer, I can return to town with Mr. Morrison. I won't impose where I'm not wanted. Jack cleared his throat. Now, hold on there. I'm not making another trip for 3 weeks. And that's if the weather holds. Storms coming in hard from the north. You send her back now. Harrow, you might as well be signing her death warrant. Caleb looked at the darkening sky, then at Eleanor. She stood perfectly still, snowflakes catching in her hair, waiting for his decision without plea or protest. There was something in her patience, her dignity in the face of his obvious reluctance, that shamed him. You can stay, he said finally, until the weather clears and we can figure out something proper. Eleanor nodded once. Thank you. I won't be a burden. I can cook, clean, mend, whatever needs doing. I'm not afraid of hard work. Jack helped unload her things, 2 modest trunks and a carpet bag, before climbing back onto his wagon. I'll be back in 3 weeks, weather permitting. You two try not to kill each other before then. He gave Caleb a meaningful look. Your sister's a smart woman. Harrow, maybe trust her judgment for once. As the wagon disappeared into the swirling snow, Caleb found himself alone with Eleanor Vaughn. She stood by her trunks, waiting for direction, and he realized he had no idea what to do with a woman in his home. I'll help you with your things, he said awkwardly, lifting one of the trunks. There's a small room off the main one. It's not much, but it's private. That will be fine, Eleanor said, picking up her carpet bag. I don't require much. Inside, Caleb showed her to the lean-to room he'd used for storage. It held a narrow bed, a small table, and little else. Eleanor surveyed it without comment, setting her bag down carefully. I apologize for the sparse accommodations, Caleb began, but she held up a hand. Mr. Harrow, I didn't come here expecting luxury. I came because... She paused, seeming to weigh her words. Because I needed a new beginning, a place to start over. Your sister's letter suggested you might understand that need. There was something in the way she said it, a weight beneath the simple words, that made Caleb wonder what she was running from. But he didn't ask. Out here, everyone had their reasons for choosing isolation, and prying into them was considered poor manners. Supper's usually simple, he said instead. Beans, biscuits, whatever game I can bring in. The stove's temperamental, and the wind comes through the chinks in the walls. It's a hard life, Miss Vaughn. Mrs. Vaughn, she corrected softly, then added, I'm a widow. The revelation hung between them for a moment. Caleb nodded, filed the information away without question. A widow at her age meant tragedy of some kind, but that was her story to tell or keep. Well then, Mrs. Vaughn, I'll leave you to settle in. There's water in the pitcher, and the outhouse is behind the cabin. We'll discuss arrangements once you've had time to rest. He turned to go, but her voice stopped him. Mr. Harrow, your sister spoke highly of you in her letters. She said you were a good man who'd lost his way to loneliness. I want you to know I'm not here to trap you into anything. If, after a reasonable time, we don't suit, I'll find other arrangements. But I hope we might at least find friendship in this wilderness. Caleb looked back at her, standing in the dim light of the small room, snow melting from her traveling cloak. There was strength in her bearing, but also a vulnerability she was trying hard to hide. For the first time since Rose's letter arrived, he felt something other than anger at his sister's interference. We'll see, Mrs. Vaughn, he said finally. We'll see. As he closed the door behind him, Caleb wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Outside, the storm was building, sealing them into this remote corner of the world. Come morning, the passes would be blocked, and Eleanor Vaughn would be as trapped here as he was. He stoked the fire in the main room stove, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about in his space. Change had come to his quiet life whether he wanted it or not. Wearing the face of a woman with sad gray eyes and secrets she kept as close as her traveling cloak. The winter would be long, and Caleb had the unsettling feeling that by spring, nothing would be the same. The first week passed in careful choreography, 2 strangers learning to navigate shared space without collision. Eleanor rose before dawn, moving quietly through the cabin to start the stove and begin breakfast. By the time Caleb returned from feeding the horses, coffee would be brewing and biscuits warming in the oven. She'd transformed his haphazard kitchen into something resembling order, organizing his meager supplies and somehow making meals that tasted better than anything he'd managed alone. The cabin itself began to change under her quiet influence. Torn shirts appeared mended in his drawer. The floors gained a shine he hadn't known the old wood possessed. She'd even fashioned curtains from an old blanket, softening the harsh light that streamed through the windows. Caleb found himself noticing these small touches with a mixture of appreciation and unease. His solitary fortress was becoming something else, something that acknowledged comfort as more than mere survival. Outside, winter tightened its grip on the land. Snow fell steadily, banking against the cabin walls and turning the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful. The temperature plummeted until even breathing hurt, and ice formed on the inside of the windows each night. Caleb watched the weather with growing concern. His horses needed more feed to stay warm, and their supply was running lower than he'd planned. "Wolf tracks," he announced one morning, pointing to the prints circling the corral. "Pack's been pushed down from the high country by the snow." "They're getting bold." Eleanor stood beside him, wrapped in a heavy shawl, studying the tracks with interest rather than fear. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. They're testing, seeing how close they can get." He glanced at her. "You know how to shoot?" "No," she admitted. "It wasn't considered necessary in Philadelphia. It's necessary here." He fetched his old Springfield rifle from the cabin. "Tomorrow, I'll teach you. Every person on the frontier should know how to protect themselves." That night, Eleanor's screams woke him from dead sleep. Caleb stumbled from his bedroll by the stove, disoriented in the darkness. Through the thin wall, he could hear her thrashing, crying out words that made no sense. Something about him and blood and please, no more. He hesitated at her door, uncertain. Wake her? Let the nightmare run its course? Another cry, filled with such terror that his decision was made. He pushed open the door to find her tangled in her blankets, hair wild, face wet with tears even in sleep. "Mrs. Vaughn," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Eleanor, wake up. You're safe." Her eyes flew open, unfocused and frightened. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him or where she was. Then awareness returned, and with it, a flush of embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "I didn't mean to wake you." "Nightmares?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Sometimes. I'm sorry. I should have warned you. Nothing to apologize for." He shifted awkwardly in the doorway. Would you like some coffee? Sometimes it helps to be fully awake after dreams like that." "Yes," she said gratefully. "Thank you." They sat by the stove in companionable silence, sipping coffee while the wind rattled the windows. Caleb didn't press for explanations, and Eleanor didn't offer any, but something had shifted between them. The acknowledgement of vulnerability, perhaps, or simply the recognition that they both carried wounds that showed themselves in the dark hours before dawn. 2 days later, Caleb took his rifle to check trap lines he'd set along the creek. The hunting had been poor lately, and they needed meat to supplement their dwindling stores. He was examining a sprung trap when he heard horses approaching, unusual enough to make him take cover behind a boulder, rifle ready. 3 men emerged from the tree line, their mounts laboring through the deep snow. Caleb recognized 2 as traders who sometimes passed through, but the third was a stranger, well-dressed despite the weather, with the look of a man unaccustomed to frontier hardship. "Morning, Harrow," called Ben Frost, one of the traders. "Didn't mean to spook you." Caleb emerged from cover but kept his rifle handy. "Ben, Tom, what brings you out in this weather?" "Heading to Cedar Falls," Tom answered. "This gentleman hired us as guides. He's looking for someone." The stranger urged his horse forward. He was perhaps 40, with pale eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. Samuel Crawford. He introduced himself. I'm searching for a young woman who may have passed this way. Brown hair, gray eyes, about 25. She would have arrived recently, possibly on the supply wagon route. Caleb's expression remained neutral. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description. Not many women travel through here, especially in winter. Crawford studied him carefully. You're certain? She might be using a different name. I'm her employer. She left rather suddenly, and her family is concerned. Like I said, haven't seen her. Caleb met the man's gaze steadily. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have traps to check. Of course. Crawford tipped his hat. If you do happen to encounter her, I'm staying in Cedar Falls. There would be a reward for information. After they left, Caleb abandoned his trap line and headed back to the cabin, unease sitting heavy in his gut. He found Eleanor kneading bread dough, flour dusting her arms. She looked up at his entrance, and something in his face made her hands still. What is it? She asked. Man came through looking for a woman, brown hair, gray eyes, about 25. He watched her carefully. Said he was her employer. The color drained from Eleanor's face. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. What did you tell him? That I hadn't seen anyone like that? He set down his rifle. Was I lying? Eleanor? She was quiet for a long moment, then resumed kneading with deliberate motions. I told you I needed a new beginning. I meant it. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give right now. She looked up at him, those gray eyes pleading. I'm not a criminal. Caleb, I've done nothing wrong except try to save my own life. Can that be enough for now? He wanted to press, to demand the truth, but something in her desperation stopped him. Whatever she was running from, it was real enough to drive her to this God-forsaken corner of the world in winter. Real enough to give her nightmares. For now, he agreed. But if trouble follows you here, I need to know what I'm facing. That night, the temperature dropped so severely that ice formed on the inside walls. Caleb's usual spot by the stove wasn't enough. He could see his breath in the air, and frost was forming on his blankets. He endured it for an hour before admitting defeat. Eleanor, he called through her door. We need to share heat or we'll freeze. I'll sleep on the floor, but we need to be in the same room. She emerged wrapped in every blanket she owned, teeth chattering. The floor won't help if you're frozen. We'll share the bed. We're both adults, and survival takes precedence over propriety. They arranged themselves carefully, fully clothed, with a careful distance between them that lasted exactly as long as it took for the cold to drive them together. Caleb found himself curled around her smaller form, sharing warmth in the most basic human way while the storm raged outside. Neither spoke. Neither acknowledged the strange intimacy of the moment, her back pressed against his chest, his arm draped over her waist, their breathing gradually synchronizing. It was survival. Nothing more, but in the darkness, with death scratching at the windows, the warmth they shared felt like something sacred. When morning came, they separated without comment, returning to their careful dance of politeness. But something fundamental had changed. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, discovered a comfort in each other's presence that made the cabin feel less like a prison and more like a shelter. Eleanor made breakfast while Caleb tended the horses, both pretending the night hadn't happened. But when their hands accidentally touched passing a coffee cup, neither pulled away quite as quickly as they might have before, and when darkness fell again, bringing with it another brutal cold snap, they wordlessly prepared to share the bed again, this time without the pretense of reluctance. The winter was teaching them its harsh lessons, that survival sometimes meant setting aside the rules of civilization, that warmth was more precious than pride, and that loneliness could be more dangerous than any wolf pack howling in the darkness beyond their walls. The thaw came slowly, reluctant sunshine breaking through weeks of gray. Water dripped from icicles hanging like teeth from the cabin's eaves, and the snow began its gradual retreat, revealing the brown earth beneath. With the easing weather came a different kind of thaw between Caleb and Eleanor. Careful conversations by the fire that stretched beyond mere necessity. "I trained as a nurse," Eleanor told him one evening, mending one of his shirts with precise stitches. "My mother thought it unseemly, but I loved the work. The precision of it, the ability to help people heal. Useful skill out here," Caleb observed. "Not many doctors willing to make the journey to the frontier. Is that why you stay? The isolation?" She glanced up from her sewing. "Your sister mentioned you weren't always a hermit?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching the fire dance in the stove. "My father was a drunk. Mean one, too. Took it out on me. My mother. Rose when she came along. Ma died when I was 15. Just gave up. I think. Couldn't take any more." Eleanor's hand stilled on the fabric. "I'm sorry. After she passed, I tried to protect Rose, but I was just a kid myself." One night, Father came home worse than usual. Had his belt off before he even made it through the door. I fought back, hurt him bad enough that he never touched us again. But I scared myself that night. Saw how easy it was to become like him when anger took hold. "You protected your sister," Eleanor said softly. "That's not the same as cruelty for its own sake." "Maybe, but I figured it was safer out here, away from people. Can't hurt anyone if there's no one around to hurt." He gave a bitter laugh. "Then Rose goes and sends me a wife. A temporary boarder," Eleanor corrected with a small smile. "Unless you've changed your mind about the arrangement." The question hung between them, unanswered. They'd grown comfortable with each other these past weeks, but comfort wasn't commitment. Neither had forgotten the stranger searching for a brown-haired woman, or the nightmares that still occasionally woke them both. The next morning brought crisis. Caleb had taken his favorite mare, Buttercup, to check the eastern boundary when they hit a patch of ice hidden beneath fresh snow. The horse went down hard, throwing Caleb against a boulder before he could kick free of the stirrups. Pain exploded through his shoulder and ribs as he hit, leaving him gasping in the snow while Buttercup struggled to her feet, favoring her left foreleg. Somehow, he managed to lead the limping horse home, each step sending fire through his injuries. Eleanor saw them coming from the window and met them in the yard, taking in his pale face and the way he cradled his left arm. "Inside," she ordered, her nurse's training evident in the sudden authority of her voice. "Now!" She helped him to a chair and began her examination with gentle but firm hands. When she pressed against his ribs, he couldn't suppress a groan. 2, maybe 3, cracked ribs, she diagnosed. "And this shoulder is dislocated. I need to reset it." "You know how? I've assisted with it before." She met his eyes. "It's going to hurt." "Can't be worse than—" His words cut off in a sharp cry as she manipulated his shoulder with a swift, practiced movement. The joint slipped back into place with an audible pop, and the relief was immediate despite the lingering pain. "There." Her hands remained on his shoulder, steadying him. "The ribs will need binding." She helped him remove his shirt, her touch clinical but gentle, as she wound strips of cloth around his torso. Caleb found himself studying her face, the concentration in her eyes, the way she bit her lower lip while working. When she leaned close to secure the binding, he caught the scent of her hair. Lavender soap somehow maintained even in their primitive conditions. "Eleanor," he said quietly. She looked up, suddenly aware of their proximity. Her hands stilled against his chest, and something electric passed between them. For a moment, neither moved. Then she stepped back, professional mask sliding back into place. "You'll need to rest. No heavy work for at least 2 weeks. The horses, I'll manage the horses." At his skeptical look, she raised an eyebrow. "I may be from Philadelphia, but I've learned a thing or two these past weeks. Have a little faith, Mr. Harrow." That evening, as promised, she handled the feeding and made sure Buttercup's leg was properly wrapped. Caleb watched from the window, pride warring with something warmer as she moved confidently among his horses. speaking to them in the same gentle tone she used when she thought he wasn't listening. The storm within her revealed itself that night, unable to lie flat with his ribs. Caleb dozed fitfully in the chair by the stove. Eleanor had insisted on giving him her bed, but he'd refused, compromising on the chair. Near midnight, soft footsteps woke him. Eleanor stood by the window in her nightgown, arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the moonlit snow. In the silver light, tears tracked down her cheeks. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She startled, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. These ribs have their own schedule." He studied her profile. "Want to talk about it?" "My husband," she said after a long pause. "Today would have been our anniversary. He's been dead 2 years, but sometimes it feels like yesterday." Caleb finished. "I know that feeling." She turned to face him fully. "He was a good man, kind, gentle, everything a husband should be. We had 6 months together before the fever took him. 6 months of happiness, and then—" She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I wasn't ready to be a widow at 23. Wasn't ready for any of it." "Is that why you came west, running from memories?" "Partly." She moved closer, settling on the floor near his chair. "After James died, I had to make my own way. My parents were gone, no family to speak of. I took a position as a private nurse for a wealthy family in Philadelphia, the Blackwood family." Something in her tone made Caleb lean forward despite the protest from his ribs. "The man looking for you, Crawford, he worked for them." Eleanor drew her knees to her chest, making herself small. "He was their son, Samuel Blackwood. He became interested in me. I refused his advances, tried to maintain professional boundaries. But men like him aren't used to being refused." "Did he hurt you?" The question came out rougher than intended. "Not in the way you mean, but he made my life impossible. Threats, intimidation, spreading rumors that I had stolen from the family. I couldn't find other work, couldn't escape his reach in the city. When I saw your sister's advertisement, it seemed like salvation. A chance to disappear somewhere he'd never think to look. So you lied about your name." "Vaughn was my maiden name. I'm not lying about who I am, just selective about which parts I share." She looked up at him. "Are you angry?" Caleb considered the question. "No. We all have our reasons for being out here. Yours are better than most. I should have told you sooner, especially after Crawford appeared. I've put you at risk. I knew the risks when I didn't turn you in." He reached down, ignoring the pain, to touch her shoulder. "You're under my protection now. Eleanor, that means something out here." She covered his hand with hers, and they stayed like that for a moment. Two damaged people finding unexpected comfort in the wilderness. Then, with the same unspoken agreement that had carried them through cold nights, Eleanor rose and helped him to the bed. "You can't sleep in that chair with broken ribs," she said firmly. "We'll share, like before, for warmth." This time, there was no pretense of maintaining distance. Eleanor curved against his uninjured side, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder as naturally as if it belonged there. Caleb's arm came around her, holding her close, and felt something inside himself unknot for the first time in years. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For seeing me as more than my mistakes, for offering protection without demanding payment, for being a good man who doesn't know it." He pressed his lips to her hair, breathing in lavender and courage. "Rest now. We'll face whatever comes together." As sleep finally took them, the cabin felt less like a refuge from the world and more like the beginning of something new. Outside, spring continued its slow arrival, promising change and challenge in equal measure. But inside, two hearts began the delicate process of healing, finding in each other the possibility of a future neither had dared imagine. The wolves still howled in the distant mountains, and danger still lurked in the form of well-dressed men with pale eyes. But for tonight, there was warmth and trust, and the quiet understanding that some bonds were forged not in spite of hardship, but because of it. Spring arrived in earnest, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and revealing the scars winter had left on the land. Caleb's ribs had healed enough for him to resume his full duties, though Eleanor still watched him with a nurse's careful eye whenever he lifted anything heavy. They'd fallen into a rhythm, comfortable, companionable, but with an undercurrent of something unspoken that grew stronger each day. The change in Eleanor was subtle at first. She startled at unexpected sounds, her eyes darting to the windows whenever the horses whinnied. She kept the rifle Caleb had taught her to use within easy reach, checking the loads more frequently than necessary. At night, she'd taken to walking the cabin's perimeter before bed, peering into the darkness as if expecting shadows to take form. "Market day tomorrow," Caleb announced one morning, watching her reaction carefully. "Need supplies, and the horses could use proper grain. Thought I'd head to Cedar Falls." Eleanor's knuckles whitened around her coffee cup. "How long?" "3 days. Maybe 4. Depends on the trails." He paused. "You could come with me." "No." The word came too quick, too sharp. She softened it with a forced smile. "Someone needs to watch the ranch. I'll be fine." But Caleb saw the fear she tried to hide, recognized it as the same expression she'd worn when Crawford's name was first mentioned. Still, they needed supplies, and putting off the trip would only make things harder. He left at dawn 2 days later, Eleanor standing in the doorway with the rifle across her arm, watching until he disappeared over the ridge. The unease in his gut grew with each mile, but he pushed the horses hard, determined to make the trip as quick as possible. Cedar Falls buzzed with the energy of spring. Traders, trappers, and ranchers, all converging to resupply after the long winter. Caleb conducted his business efficiently, loading the wagon with flour, coffee, ammunition, and precious glass for the windows Eleanor had mentioned wanting to expand. He was securing the last of the supplies when Tom Baker appeared at his elbow. "Harrow, that fellow's still in town. Crawford, been asking questions about every ranch within 50 miles. Mighty determined to find that woman. Not my concern," Caleb replied, but his hands moved faster, tightening the ropes. "Maybe not, but thought you should know he hired the Morrison brothers. They rode out yesterday, heading north." Ice formed in Caleb's chest. The Morrison brothers were trackers, known for finding people who didn't want to be found. North led directly to his ranch. He left within the hour, pushing the horses harder than was safe on the rough trails. The wagon bounced and rattled, supplies shifting dangerously, but he didn't slow. The sun was setting on the second day when he finally crested the ridge above his property. The cabin looked peaceful in the dying light, smoke rising from the chimney, but something was wrong. The horses were loose in the yard instead of properly corralled, and the barn door hung open. Caleb left the wagon and approached on foot, rifle ready. He found Eleanor in the cabin, barricaded behind the overturned table, his rifle trained on the door. When she recognized him, the weapon dropped from shaking hands. "They came this morning," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her body. "2 men. I fired warning shots, scared them off, but he was with them. Caleb, Samuel." "Did they hurt you?" "No, but they'll be back. Samuel won't give up. He never does." She stood, squaring her shoulders. "I need to leave. Tonight, I've brought enough trouble." "You're not going anywhere." The words came out harsher than intended. "This is your home now. Our home." "Caleb, you don't understand. Samuel, he's not just some spurned suitor. His family has power, money, connections. When I left, I took something of his." At his sharp look, she continued quickly. "Nothing valuable, just letters. Proof of what kind of man he really is. He's terrified they'll surface, ruin his reputation. In his mind, I'm a threat that needs to be eliminated." "Where are these letters?" Eleanor moved to her room, returning with a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. "I thought they were insurance, but they've become a curse. I should burn them." "No." Caleb took the packet, weighing it in his hand. "These might be the only thing keeping you safe. A man worried about his reputation can be reasoned with." That night, they prepared for siege. Caleb boarded the windows, leaving slots for shooting. Eleanor loaded every weapon they had while he reinforced the door. They worked in grim silence, both understanding that the morning would bring reckoning. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said as they settled in to watch. "I've brought violence to your peaceful life." "My life was never peaceful," Caleb replied. "Just empty. There's a difference." In the darkness, her hand found his. "If something happens tomorrow," "Nothing's going to happen. I've fought off claim jumpers, wolves, and worse. The Morrison brothers don't scare me. I'm not talking about fear." She turned to face him fully. "These weeks with you, they've meant something. You've meant something. I need you to know that before." He silenced her with a kiss, gentle but certain. When they parted, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Save the goodbyes," he said softly. "We're going to have a lot of tomorrows to fill." Dawn came with horses, 4 riders approaching slowly, cautiously. Caleb recognized the Morrison brothers' distinctive silhouettes, Crawford beside them, and a 4th man he didn't know. They stopped just outside rifle range. "Harrow," Bill Morrison called. "We're here legal-like. Mrs. Blackwood needs to answer for what she took. Send her out, and there's no trouble for you. The lady's name is Vaughn." Caleb replied through the gun slot. "And she's under my protection. You're trespassing on private property. I'll ask you once to leave." Crawford urged his horse forward. "Mr. Harrow, you seem like a reasonable man. This woman is a thief and a liar. Whatever she's told you, I know exactly who she is." Caleb interrupted. "I also know what kind of man forces his attentions on a grieving widow, then tries to destroy her when she refuses. Turn around. Crawford, there's nothing for you here. She has property that belongs to me. Personal correspondence that proves you're a predator who abused his position?" Eleanor's voice rang out clear and strong. "Those letters stay with me. Samuel, my insurance that you'll leave me in peace." Crawford's face twisted with rage. "You little—" He reached for something in his coat. The shot came from the cabin's left window, Eleanor's window. Crawford's hat flew from his head, and his horse reared. By the time he got the animal under control, Caleb had his rifle trained dead center on the man's chest. "Next one won't miss," Eleanor called. "I've learned a lot about shooting since Philadelphia. Samuel, amazing what desperation can teach you." The Morrison brothers exchanged glances. They were trackers, not gunfighters, and the job suddenly looked more complicated than advertised. "This isn't over," Crawford snarled, but he was already backing his horse away. "You can't hide forever, either of you." "We're not hiding," Caleb replied. "We're living. There's a difference. Now get off my land before my wife decides to practice her marksmanship some more." The word wife hung in the air like a challenge. Crawford's face went pale, then red, but the Morrison brothers were already turning their horses. After a moment of impotent fury, Crawford followed. They watched from the windows until the riders disappeared over the ridge. Only then did Eleanor lower her rifle, hands trembling with delayed reaction. "Your wife?" she asked softly. Caleb set his weapon aside and drew her into his arms. "If you'll have me, seems we already share a bed, a home, a life. Might as well make it official." She laughed, a sound caught between joy and tears. "Caleb Harrow? Is that your idea of a proposal?" "I'm not good with words." He cupped her face in his calloused hands. "But I know you belong here. With me, I know I want to wake up beside you every morning and face whatever comes together. I know my life started making sense the day you arrived with snow in your hair and secrets in your eyes." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." They held each other as the sun climbed higher, knowing Crawford might return, knowing challenges lay ahead. But for now, they'd won this battle. The letters remained their insurance, the ranch their fortress, and their love, unexpected and hard-won, their greatest weapon against whatever darkness might come calling. Outside, Buttercup whinnied, reminding them that life went on. Horses needed feeding, chores needed doing, and a future needed building. They'd faced down the past and emerged victorious. Now came the harder task, learning to trust in happiness, to believe in tomorrow, to build something lasting in a land that tested everything it touched. But as Eleanor smiled up at him, Caleb thought maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The days following Crawford's visit stretched taut as a bowstring. Caleb went through the motions of ranch work, but his mind churned with the implications of what had transpired. The word wife had slipped from his lips like truth, but now, in the light of day, its weight pressed upon him. Eleanor moved through her chores with a similar distraction, their comfortable routine disrupted by unspoken questions. "You didn't mean it," Eleanor said finally, 3 days later, as they sat by the evening fire. "What you said to Crawford, about me being your wife." Caleb set down the harness he'd been mending. "I meant every word. Said in the heat of the moment, to protect Eleanor." He turned to face her fully. "I'm not a man who speaks carelessly. When I called you my wife, it wasn't strategy, it was hope." She studied his face, searching for something. "I've already been married once. Caleb, I know what it means to make those vows, to lose someone you've pledged your life to. I don't know if I can. I'm not James," he said gently. "I'm not asking you to forget him or replace what you had. I'm asking you to build something new, something that's ours." Eleanor rose abruptly, pacing to the window. "You don't understand. There are things about that last night in Philadelphia. Samuel wasn't just making threats. There was a fire at the Blackwood mansion. I barely escaped. They blamed me, said I set it deliberately. If he brings law into this, did you set it?" She whirled to face him. "The lamp fell when I was trying to get away. I grabbed what I could, the letters, some money that was owed to me, and ran. But in his version, I'm an arsonist and a thief." Caleb absorbed this information, watching emotions play across her face. Fear, shame, defiance. "Still want to marry you," he said simply. "How can you say that? I've brought nothing but trouble. I'm a wanted woman. Caleb, at best, we'd live always looking over our shoulders. At worst," he stood, closing the distance between them. "At worst, we face whatever comes together. That's what marriage means out here. Not some fairy tale, but a partnership. You watch my back, I watch yours. I can't let you sacrifice." "Who says it's sacrifice?" His voice roughened with emotion he rarely let show. "You think I was living before you came? I was existing, going through motions, day after day, telling myself isolation was the same as peace. You changed that." Eleanor's composure finally cracked. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Not of Samuel or the law, but of hoping again, of building something beautiful just to watch it burn." "Everything burns eventually," Caleb said, "but some things are worth the risk. You taught me that." That night, Eleanor made a decision. She rose before dawn, dressed silently, and began packing her few belongings. The letter she left was brief. "I won't let my past destroy your future. Please don't follow. Be happy. E." She'd saddled Caleb's gentlest mare and was leading her from the barn when his voice stopped her. "Running away in the night? Thought you were braver than that." She turned to find him leaning against the barn door, fully dressed. "How did you—" "Spent 2 weeks sharing a bed. Know you're breathing when you're really asleep versus pretending." He pushed off from the door. "Where were you planning to go?" "California, Oregon, somewhere far enough that I couldn't find you?" He shook his head. "Eleanor, if you want to leave, I won't stop you. But don't insult us both by sneaking off like a thief." "I am a thief. Remember? Ask Samuel." Bitterness crept into her voice. "You're a survivor," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference. And you're the woman I love. Though God knows you make it difficult sometimes." The words hung between them, stark and honest in the pre-dawn darkness. Eleanor's hand slipped from the horse's bridle. "You've never said that before," she whispered. "Lot of things I haven't said. Doesn't make them less true." He moved closer, close enough to see tears tracking down her cheeks. "Stay. Fight. Build something with me. Or go, and I'll spend the rest of my days knowing I let the best thing in my life walk away because I was too proud to fight for it." Eleanor dropped the packed bag. her resolve crumbling. "I don't know how to stop running." "Then don't run to me instead of away." He opened his arms, and she fell into them, shaking with suppressed sobs. "I love you too," she said against his chest. "That's why I have to go. Love means protecting. Love means choosing each other again and again, especially when it's hard." He pulled back to look at her. "Marry me, Eleanor. Today. Now. Before you talk yourself out of it again. Now. It's barely dawn. Sun's coming up. That's all the ceremony we need out here." He took her hands. "Unless you want to wait, ride to town, do it proper." "No." The word came fierce and certain. No more waiting. No more fear. She looked around the yard, at the mountains beginning to glow with the early light. "Here, our place, our beginning." They stood facing each other as the sun crested the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Caleb took a breath, steadying himself. "I, Caleb Harrow, take you, Eleanor Vaughn. As my wife, I promise to stand beside you, protect you, and love you through whatever storms may come. Your past is my past. Your future is my future. From this day forward." Eleanor's voice shook, but her eyes were steady. "I, Eleanor Vaughn, take you, Caleb Harrow, as my husband. I promise to trust you with my secrets, my fears, and my heart, to build a life with you in this wild place, to choose courage over fear, and love over loneliness. From this day forward." They had no rings, no witnesses save the horses and the mountains. But as Caleb kissed his bride, the sunrise blessing their union with warmth and light, neither felt the lack. This was frontier marriage, raw, honest, and unadorned. "Mrs. Harrow," Caleb murmured against her lips. "Has a nice sound." "Better than Mrs. Blackwood would have." Eleanor agreed, and they both laughed, releasing weeks of tension in that shared moment of dark humor. They returned to the cabin hand in hand, unpacking Eleanor's hastily filled bag with sheepish smiles. The day proceeded like any other, chores to complete, animals to tend, but everything felt different, charged with purpose. They were building something together now, officially, irrevocably. That evening, as they prepared their simple meal side by side, Eleanor asked, "What do we do when Crawford returns?" "Because he will. Men like him don't give up easily." "Then we face him as husband and wife. Your legal status changes things. Harder to drag a married woman back east on old accusations." Caleb considered. "Might be time to write Rose. Tell her the advertisement worked better than expected." "She'll be insufferable," Eleanor warned. "Take full credit for our happiness." "Let her. She earned it." He pulled Eleanor close, though I think we did most of the hard work ourselves. Outside, night settled over the ranch, bringing its familiar sounds, wind through pine, the distant howl of wolves, the settling of the cabin's logs. But inside, two people who'd found each other against all odds began the delicate work of building a marriage. Not the fairy tale kind, built on grand gestures and perfect moments, but the real kind, forged in hardship, tempered by trust, and strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead. The past still lurked in the shadows. Crawford still posed a threat, and the frontier still demanded its daily toll of sweat and struggle. But for tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, Caleb and Eleanor Harrow were simply two people who'd chosen each other, finding in that choice a courage neither had possessed alone. And sometimes, in the wild places of the world, that was enough to build a life on. Word traveled fast on the frontier, even across the isolated reaches where Caleb had made his home. Within 2 weeks of their sunrise wedding, the news had somehow reached Cedar Falls, carried by trappers and traders who'd noticed the change in Caleb's manner during his supply runs. No longer the silent, solitary rancher, he now spoke of my wife with quiet pride, purchasing small luxuries, soap, fabric, even a precious pane of glass that betrayed his newfound domesticity. It was this gossip that reached certain ears, setting in motion events that would test the bonds so recently forged. The first sign of trouble came with an official-looking rider. His Eastern clothes and clean-shaven face marking him as distinctly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the territory. "Federal Marshal Thomas Brennan," he announced, displaying his badge when Caleb met him at the property line. "I'm looking for Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, formerly Eleanor Vaughn. I have reason to believe she's residing here." "No one by that name here," Caleb replied evenly. "Just me and my wife, Eleanor Harrow." The marshal's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "Recent marriage?" "Recent enough. Mr. Harrow, I'm not here to cause trouble for you or your wife, but there are serious allegations that need addressing. A Mr. Samuel Blackwood has filed charges. Arson, theft, assault. I'd prefer to handle this civilized-like." Eleanor appeared in the cabin doorway, her chin high despite the fear Caleb could see in her eyes. "I'm Eleanor Harrow, Marshal. How may I help you?" "Ma'am?" Brennan touched his hat. "I'll need you to accompany me to Cedar Falls. There'll be a hearing before Judge Morton. You can tell your side of things proper." "And if her side differs from Blackwood's?" Caleb asked. "That's for the judge to sort out. But I'll say this. Blackwood's awful eager for justice. Been pushing hard through official channels. Makes a lawman wonder what's got him so stirred up about one woman." Eleanor and Caleb exchanged glances. The letters, hidden beneath a floorboard, suddenly felt like both weapon and liability. "I'll come willingly, Marshal," Eleanor said. "I have nothing to hide." "We'll come," Caleb corrected. "Where my wife goes, I go." The journey to Cedar Falls took 2 days, with Marshal Brennan proving surprisingly companionable. He shared news from the east, asked about ranching, and carefully avoided discussing the charges until they reached town. Cedar Falls had grown since winter, new buildings sprouting along the main street like mushrooms after rain. The courthouse, a generous term for the large wooden structure that served multiple civic functions, buzzed with activity. Word of the hearing had spread, and curious townspeople gathered to witness the drama. Samuel Blackwood stood near the courthouse steps, immaculate despite the frontier setting. Beside him was a thin man with sharp features who could only be his lawyer. When he saw Eleanor, his expression shifted from satisfaction to something darker. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called out. "How good to see you again. Though I must say, bigamy doesn't improve your situation." "My husband is dead," Eleanor replied steadily. "You know this. You attended his funeral." "Did I?" "I recall attending a funeral. Whether the right man was in the coffin." He shrugged, the implication clear. Caleb stepped forward, but Eleanor's hand on his arm stopped him. "He's trying to provoke you," she whispered. "Don't give him the satisfaction." Inside, Judge Morton, a grizzled former cavalry officer who'd traded his sword for a gavel, called the hearing to order. The room was packed, the air thick with tobacco smoke and anticipation. Blackwood's lawyer, a Mr. Cornelius Webb from Kansas City, presented his case with practiced efficiency. Eleanor had been employed as a nurse, entrusted with access to the household. She'd attempted to seduce Mr. Blackwood, and upon rejection, had stolen valuable items and set fire to his study in revenge. Several letters were produced, purportedly from Eleanor, expressing inappropriate affection for her employer. "Forgeries," Eleanor whispered to Caleb. "I never wrote those." When called to speak, Eleanor rose with dignity. "Your Honor, I was indeed employed by the Blackwood family. I cared for Mr. Blackwood's mother in her final illness. After her death, Samuel Blackwood began making advances. When I refused and threatened to report his behavior, he began a campaign to destroy my reputation." "Can you prove these allegations?" Judge Morton asked. Eleanor glanced at Caleb, who nodded. "I have letters, Your Honor, in Mr. Blackwood's own hand, detailing his intentions and his threats when I refused him." The courtroom erupted. Blackwood shot to his feet. "Lies! Those letters were stolen from my private correspondence." "So you admit they exist?" the judge asked mildly. Webb tried to recover. "Even if such letters exist, they were obtained through theft. They cannot be admitted. This isn't a formal trial, counselor. It's a hearing to determine if charges have merit. Judge Morton looked at Eleanor. Produce these letters. Caleb had retrieved them from their hiding place before leaving the ranch. Eleanor handed them to the marshal, who passed them to the judge. As Morton read, his expression grew increasingly grim. Mr. Blackwood, he said finally, these letters paint a very different picture than your testimony suggests. They speak of a man using his position to pressure a vulnerable employee, making threats when refused. Those were private expressions of admiration, Blackwood protested. Taken out of context? The context seems quite clear. Morton set the letters aside. Now, about this fire. Was anyone hurt? Webb consulted his notes. No injuries. Your Honor, the damage was confined to Mr. Blackwood's study. Where these letters were kept? The judge's tone was dry. How convenient. Mrs. Harrow, tell me about the night of the fire. Eleanor's voice was steady as she recounted that terrifying night. Blackwood cornering her, the struggle, the lamp falling. I grabbed what I could as proof of his harassment and fled. If that makes me a thief, then yes, I'm guilty. But I was defending myself the only way I could. Your Honor, Webb interjected. Regardless of the circumstances, property was taken, damage was done. Mr. Webb, I've heard enough. Judge Morton's gavel came down hard. I find insufficient evidence to support charges of arson or assault. As for theft, he looked at Blackwood. A man who uses his power to prey on women in his employ forfeits the right to claim victimhood when they defend themselves. The crowd murmured approval. Many had sisters, daughters, wives who'd worked in service. They understood the vulnerability Eleanor described. Furthermore, Morton continued, I'm issuing a formal warning, Mr. Blackwood. If you continue to pursue Mrs. Harrow or make any attempt at retribution, you'll find frontier justice less forgiving than what you've experienced today. Marshal Brennan, please escort Mr. Blackwood to the town limits. His business here is concluded. Blackwood's face flushed purple. This isn't over. I have connections, influence, and I have a telegraph to the Kansas City authorities detailing the contents of your letters. Morton replied, I suggest you consider your reputation before pursuing this further. As Blackwood was led away, still protesting, Eleanor sagged against Caleb. The crowd began dispersing, several women stopping to press Eleanor's hand or offer words of support. Thank you, Eleanor whispered to the judge as they prepared to leave. Morton's stern expression softened slightly. Ma'am, I've got daughters. The thought of them facing what you did... He shook his head. You go on home now. Build your life. From what I hear, you married a good man. Outside, the spring sun felt like a blessing after the smoky courtroom. Rose was waiting by their wagon, having arrived that morning after receiving Caleb's letter. Eleanor, she embraced her sister-in-law warmly. I'm so glad to finally meet you properly. When Caleb wrote about the wedding, I could hardly believe it. My stubborn brother, actually taking my advice. You're meddling, you mean? Caleb grumbled, but his fond tone betrayed him. The best meddling I ever did. Rose studied them both with a nurse's knowing eye. You look good together, happy. As they prepared for the journey home, Marshal Brennan approached one last time. Folks here will remember what happened today. Word will spread. Blackwood won't find much sympathy if he tries again. You think he will? Eleanor asked. Brennan shrugged. Men like him don't like losing. But you've got the law on your side now. And more importantly, you've got each other. That counts for something out here. The ride home was quiet, each lost in thought as the familiar landscape unfolded around them. As they crested the final ridge and saw their cabin nestled in the valley below, Eleanor reached for Caleb's hand. It's over, she said wonderingly. Really over. So, that part is. Caleb agreed. Now comes the rest, the living, the building, the everyday courage of making a life together. Eleanor smiled, and in that smile was all the answer he needed. They'd faced the past and emerged victorious. Now, finally, they could turn their faces to the future. Their future, built on truth and trust and the kind of love that only grows stronger for being tested. The cabin waited for them, humble but home. As they pulled into the yard, the horses whinnied greeting, and the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, fences to mend, crops to plant, a life to build in this unforgiving land. But tonight, they were simply Caleb and Eleanor Harrow, coming home together, and that, they both knew, was victory enough. The peace following the hearing lasted exactly 3 weeks. Caleb had taken to riding the property boundaries each dawn, a habit Eleanor recognized as protective vigilance rather than mere routine. She didn't discourage it. They both knew Samuel Blackwood's public humiliation would fester like an untreated wound. The attack came on a Tuesday, washing day, when Eleanor was alone at the creek, beating clothes against the rocks. The first sign was the horses, their sudden stillness. Ears pricked toward the tree line. She reached for the rifle she'd learned to keep close, but rough hands seized her arms before she could grasp it. Well, the new Mrs. Harrow. The voice belonged to a man she didn't recognize. Scarred face, cold eyes, professional in his violence. Mr. Blackwood sends his regards. A second man emerged, smaller but no less dangerous. Boss says to make it look like an accident. Indians, maybe, or wolves. Eleanor's mind raced even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. Caleb was checking the eastern pastures, too far to hear her scream. She forced herself to remain calm, remembering his lessons about survival often depending on keeping your head when others lost theirs. Blackwood's a fool if he thinks my death will end this, she said, proud when her voice didn't shake. The letters are safe. If something happens to me, they'll be sent to every newspaper from here to Philadelphia. The scarred man laughed. Lady, we're past caring about letters. This is about teaching folks what happens when they cross Samuel Blackwood. They bound her hands, discussing her fate with chilling casualness. The smaller one favored drowning, make it look like she'd slipped on the wet rocks. The scarred one argued for something more dramatic, a message that would be understood. Eleanor worked at her bonds, the rough rope tearing her wrists. Behind her back, her fingers found a sharp edge of rock. She began sawing desperately, keeping her movements small. The thunder of hooves interrupted the men's debate, not from the east where Caleb had gone, but from the south, the direction of town. The scarred man drew his pistol, pushing Eleanor behind a boulder. Stay quiet, or your husband dies too, he hissed. But it wasn't Caleb who burst from the trees. 3 riders appeared, Marshal Brennan and 2 deputies, moving fast and purposeful. The smaller attacker cursed and ran for the trees. The scarred one tried to use Eleanor as a shield, but she chose that moment to wrench free, her bonds finally giving way. She threw herself sideways as gunfire erupted. When the dust settled, the scarred man lay groaning on the ground, clutching his shoulder. His partner had vanished into the forest, though the deputies quickly gave chase. Mrs. Harrow. Brennan helped her to her feet. Are you hurt? No. How did you... Your husband rode through town like the devil was chasing him. Said he'd seen riders on his land. Had a bad feeling. We were already looking for these 2. They left quite a trail from Kansas. Caleb arrived moments later, his horse lathered with sweat. The relief in his eyes when he saw Eleanor standing quickly transformed to rage when he noticed her bloody wrists. I'll kill him, he said flatly. And Eleanor knew he meant Blackwood, not the hired thugs. No? She gripped his arms. No, Caleb. That's what he wants, to drag us down to his level. We're better than that. The scarred man, being tended by a deputy, laughed bitterly. Better? Lady, Samuel Blackwood owns judges, politicians, half the law in Kansas. You think this ends here? Marshal Brennan crouched beside him. Maybe back east, but this is the territory. Friend, we do things different here. He looked up at Caleb and Eleanor. These men will stand trial for attempted murder. Their testimony about who hired them will be very interesting to certain federal prosecutors who've been looking at the Blackwood family's dealings. The smaller attacker was caught within the hour, trapped between the deputies and a creek swollen with spring melt. Both men, faced with frontier justice and the promise of federal investigation, proved eager to discuss their employer's instructions in detail. That night, Caleb and Eleanor sat by their fire while Marshal Brennan finished his report. The lawman had accepted their hospitality, his presence a comfort after the day's violence. "I'll telegraph the federal office in Kansas City tomorrow," Brennan said. "With these men's testimony and those letters you showed Judge Morton, Blackwood's got bigger problems than revenge. Men like him leave trails, bribes, threats, intimidation. Once investigators start pulling threads, the whole fabric unravels." "Will it be enough?" Eleanor asked. "To stop him permanently. Rich men have a way of avoiding consequences," Brennan admitted. "But at minimum, he'll be too busy protecting himself to worry about you. And the Blackwood name?" He shrugged. "That reputation he was so worried about protecting is about to become a liability." After Brennan retired to the barn for the night, Caleb and Eleanor found themselves alone with the weight of the day's events. She sat curled against him, both drawing comfort from simple proximity. "I should have been here," Caleb said, self-recrimination clear in his voice. You knew something was wrong and got help. That's what saved me." She touched his face. "We can't live in fear, Caleb. Can't second-guess every decision. When I saw those men, saw you with them," his voice roughened, "I've lost enough in this life. Eleanor, I won't lose you. You won't," she promised. "We've come too far, fought too hard. Samuel Blackwood is just a man, cruel, vindictive, but mortal. His power comes from others' fear. We've shown we won't be intimidated." A wolf howled in the distance, answered by another. The sound that once seemed threatening now felt almost companionable. Wild creatures going about their lives, indifferent to human drama. "The marshal leaves tomorrow," Caleb said eventually. "We'll be alone again." "Not alone. Together." Eleanor shifted to look at him directly. "And maybe it's time we thought about making our family larger. This land needs children to run through the grass, to learn the horses, to carry on what we're building." Caleb's hand moved to rest over her stomach, the gesture tender and questioning. "You mean?" "Not yet," she said softly. "But I've been thinking, all this fighting to preserve life, maybe it's time we created some." The conversation drifted to gentler topics. Plans for expanding the cabin, improving the ranch, the future they were determined to claim despite all obstacles. Outside, clouds gathered, promising rain to nourish the spring growth. In the morning, Marshal Brennan departed with his prisoners, but not before leaving them with reassurance. "I'll keep you informed of developments. And Mrs. Harrow, you showed real courage yesterday. Your husband's a lucky man." "We're both lucky," Eleanor replied, taking Caleb's hand. As they watched the marshal's party disappear over the ridge, Caleb pulled Eleanor close. "Think it's really over?" "This part is, Blackwood will be too busy saving himself to worry about us. And if he's not," she smiled, fierce and determined, "we'll face it like we always do. Together." They turned back to their cabin, to the life they were building day by day. The morning chores waited, horses to feed, repairs to make, the endless work of frontier living. But it felt different now, lighter somehow. The shadow that had hung over them was lifting, burned away by truth and justice and their own refusal to be victims. The attack had been meant to break them. Instead, it had proven their strength, not just as individuals, but as partners. Whatever came next, they would meet it standing together, rooted in this land they'd claimed and the love they'd forged in the crucible of adversity. Eleanor began humming as she worked, a melody from her Philadelphia days transformed by frontier rhythms. Caleb found himself smiling as he repaired the corral fence, planning expansions for the family they'd spoken of in the dark hours of morning. Life went on, stubborn and hopeful as spring grass pushing through snow, and in that daily choice to build rather than fear, lay their greatest victory over men like Samuel Blackwood, who understood only destruction. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth and coaxing green from the ground, and Caleb and Eleanor Harrow worked side by side, writing their future in sweat and hope, and the quiet certainty that some things, love, courage, truth, could not be bought or threatened away. 1 year had passed since the day 2 hired men tried to silence Eleanor forever. The seasons had turned their great wheel, bringing snow and thaw, planting and harvest, and with them a peace that felt earned rather than simply hoped for. The ranch had transformed under their combined efforts. New fencing stretched toward the mountains. A larger corral held a growing herd, and the cabin had gained an additional room, its purpose becoming clear with Eleanor's expanding silhouette. Marshal Brennan's last letter, arriving with the autumn supplies, had brought the news they'd waited for. Samuel Blackwood's empire had crumbled under federal investigation. The man himself had fled to Europe, his assets seized, his name synonymous with scandal. The Blackwood who'd once terrorized a young widow now existed only as a cautionary tale told in Eastern drawing rooms. "It's finished," Eleanor had said, folding the letter carefully. Really, truly finished. Now, as spring returned to the mountains, she stood in their doorway watching Caleb work with a new colt, his movements patient and sure. Her hand rested on her rounded belly, feeling the life within respond to its father's voice carrying on the wind. "You'll have your daddy's gentle hands," she murmured, "and hopefully your mother's good sense." Rose emerged from the cabin, drying her hands on her apron. She'd arrived 2 weeks prior, insisting her skills as both midwife and sister were needed. "Still a month to go," she said, joining Eleanor in the doorway. "Plenty of time to drive Caleb half mad with worry." "He hovers," Eleanor admitted with a smile. "Yesterday he tried to convince me that gathering eggs was too strenuous." The same man who once lived alone on this mountain, surviving on stubbornness and beans. Rose shook her head. Amazing what love does to a person. Love had indeed worked its transformations. The taciturn rancher who'd greeted Eleanor with suspicion now spoke freely of plans and dreams. The frightened woman who'd arrived in a snowstorm had become the heart of this small ranch, her quiet strength the foundation on which their life was built. "Letter came from Philadelphia," Rose said, producing an envelope from her pocket. "Addressed to you." Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately. Mrs. Wellington, the elderly woman who'd been her only friend during those dark days in the Blackwood household. She read quickly, then slower, tears gathering in her eyes. "What is it?" Rose asked, concerned. "James's mother, my first husband's mother. She's been looking for me since I disappeared. Mrs. Wellington helped her trace me here." Eleanor wiped her eyes. "She wants to know she has no claim on me, no expectations. She just wanted to know I was safe, that I'd found happiness again." She looked out at Caleb, now leading the colt in slow circles, his voice a constant, soothing murmur. "I have, haven't I? Found happiness." "Built it, more like," Rose corrected. "Brick by stubborn brick." That evening, they gathered for supper in the expanded kitchen, Caleb, Eleanor, and Rose around the table that had once served a solitary man's simple meals. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the comfortable silences of family. "Been thinking," Caleb said, pushing back from his empty plate. "That northern pasture would support more horses, maybe some cattle too. Build this place into something proper to pass on." "Already planning our child's inheritance," Eleanor teased. "They haven't even arrived yet. Never too early to plan." He reached for her hand across the table. "Want to leave them more than I was left, more than just land and livestock. Want to leave them the knowledge they were wanted, planned for, loved before they drew their first breath." Rose discreetly wiped her eyes. "Listen to you, waxing poetical. What happened to my gruff brother?" "You're meddling," Caleb replied, but his smile was warm. "Best thing you ever did, sending Eleanor my way." Later, as Rose retired to the new room and night settled over the ranch, Caleb and Eleanor sat on the porch he'd built last summer. The stars emerged one by one, diamonds against velvet. While somewhere in the darkness, a night bird called. "Regrets?" Caleb asked, an old question between them, ritual more than inquiry. "None," Eleanor replied, as she always did. Then, reconsidering, maybe one. I wish James could have known you. I think he would have been glad, knowing I found someone who'd care for me the way he no longer could. I'm grateful to him, Caleb said quietly, for loving you first, for teaching you that love was worth the risk, made my job easier. Eleanor laughed softly. Easier? You call our courtship easy? Worth it, then. Every moment of doubt, every challenge faced. His hand covered hers on her belly. Let us hear. A coyote yipped in the distance, answered by another. The ranch horse whinnied sleepily. Life in all its forms persisted in this harsh land, adapting, enduring, sometimes even thriving. They'd done the same, two damaged souls who'd found each other in the wilderness and chosen to heal together rather than apart. The baby will come during the full moon, Eleanor said with quiet certainty. I can feel it. This land's rhythms are in my bones now. Our child will be born to this place. Caleb mused. Won't know any other home. The mountains will be their playground, the horses their first friends, and they'll know they were born from love, not fear, from choice, not obligation. Eleanor turned to face him. That's the greatest gift we can give them, the knowledge that love can conquer the hardest winters, the darkest nights. As if in response, the child within her moved, a flutter of life asserting itself. Caleb's face transformed with wonder, as it did every time he felt their baby's movements. Still can't quite believe it's real, he admitted. This life, you, the little one coming, sometimes I think I'll wake up and be alone again. Then I'll just have to keep reminding you, Eleanor said, drawing his head down for a kiss. Every morning, every night, until you believe in happiness the way you believe in sunrise. They sat together as the moon rose, full and bright, blessing their small corner of the world with silver light. Inside, Rose hummed as she prepared for bed, the sound of family filling spaces that had too long stood empty. Their horses dozed in the corral Caleb had built with his own hands. The cabin that had once sheltered a single broken soul now held 3 hearts, soon to be 4. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to their journey from solitude to connection, from fear to trust, from survival to truly living. What had begun with a sister's well-meaning interference and a desperate woman's flight had become something neither could have imagined. A love story written not in grand gestures, but in daily choices, quiet courage, and the decision to face whatever came standing together. In the morning, there would be chores to tend, preparations to make for the coming child, the endless work of frontier life. But tonight, Caleb and Eleanor Harrow sat in perfect contentment, their past sorrows transformed into future hopes, their love a light that no darkness could extinguish. And somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, not in threat or sorrow, but in simple declaration of existence. We are here, the cry seemed to say. Despite everything, we endure. On the porch of a cabin at the edge of forever, 2 people who'd found their way through winter's worst storms smiled and silently agreed. Yes, they were here. They had endured. And in the enduring, they had discovered something worth more than safety or solitude. They had found home in each other, and in that finding, made themselves whole. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love and redemption in the Old West. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, whether you're driving through the prairie, sitting by your own fireplace, or perhaps even somewhere in the mountains like Caleb and Eleanor. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts about Eleanor and Caleb's journey in the comments below. Did their story touch your heart? What part resonated with you most? Let's gather round our virtual campfire and share what the Old West means to us. Happy trails, partners.